couple of years. I've just put it on. If you go to blog.independencelive.net, again, that's blog.independencelive.net. You can see a copy of the draft constitution that I have been working on. And now we are about to see the first of a series of short 20-minute videos explaining different aspects of the Constitution. So we'll watch that. That was recorded earlier today. And then after it, I hope to have a discussion with Elliot Bulmer, constitutional scholar, Scottish constitutional scholar, who should be just joining us later. So please enjoy the first video that I have made in this series, and I will see you after the end of the video.
Good evening. This is
okay. Can you hear me?
Mark
And it's not.
I'm I'm an associate professor of American
Okay.
Studies, Law, and Political Science at the University of Rennes in Brittany, France. And this is the first of a series of podcasts that I'll be doing about a written constitution for a Scottish secular republic. So this is something that I've been focusing on for quite some time. Just to give you a little bit of about my experience prior to the referendum in 2014, and from 2012 to 2014, I wrote a series of articles in Newsnet Scotland about the possibilities of what could be included in a written Scottish constitution. Unfortunately, the result of the 2014 referendum was such that these ideas could not be employed. However, in 2016, I spent 3 months in Catalonia, and I had the pleasure to work with a group of people named Constituïm, who drafted a constitution for a Catalan republic, and I had the great pleasure to help them to translate that into English, and so getting a lot of ideas from that as well. More broadly, my studies have been in American politics, American constitutional law, and so I've seen, I've studied that, issue quite a lot, and coming at it from a perspective of how could things be done differently, and how could a constitution be better drafted, especially now, knowing what we know and with more modern ideas. How could that be drafted? Now, the United States Constitution, in my view, is no longer fit for purpose. It should be. There are so many things that they could not have anticipated back in 1789 when the U.S. Constitution was ratified. So the question I would like to begin is if you could have a draft now, if you could draft a new constitution, what would it include to avoid a lot of the pitfalls and a lot of the issues that plague, for example, the American constitutional setup at this point? And so it's very interesting to reflect on what could be included in a Scottish constitution that could resolve many of the issues that are present in other constitutions and other systems, most notably, for me at least, the United States. So the first question I'd like to begin to address is, why should we begin this discussion now? There's not been a referendum announced yet, so arguably you could say it's too early, but I would say that given the Brexit deadline coming up within just over a year, we need to begin to discuss what type of form that a new Scottish independent government would take, and what constitutional provisions could be in there. I think we do need to begin to do it now, because once a referendum is called, it's going to be the context is going to be much more intense. So it's kind of a quiet before the storm right now, and so we can have a calm discussion before the intensity of a second referendum becomes upon us, and then even more intense if there's a yes vote. All of the special interests and banks and financial institutions, which would be seeking to craft a Scottish government to their advantage and seek to kind of elbow their way into this constitution making process. And so we want to begin our work earlier so that we can have, be well ahead of the game in terms of ideas of what, of what a constitution could entail. Also, the fact that I'm simply an EU citizen who has an intense interest in Scotland. I'm not part of the. I'm a member of the SNP, but I'm certainly not a big player in that, or necessarily of the Yes movement. I'm involved in the Yes movement certainly, but I'm also just a citizen who is very interested in seeing a better country emerge from any independence referendum. So those are why I think we should begin this discussion now, kind of in the calm before the storm, before it becomes much more intense. So the question you want to begin to think about is what, if you could build a state from scratch, a tabula rasa or a blank slate, how would you build it, and how would you build a constitution differently from what from what what Scotland currently enjoys under the UK. And so there's all kinds of, I mean, certainly many ideas spring forth, but we want to also first of all speak about why there should be a written constitution. There's many ideas on this, and this is by no means an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. But first of all, it's the a constitution can be a proclamation of collective values. And to say what the country stands for, what the country envisions, equality. Of course, in France, you have the liberty, equality, fraternity as these kind of standard, kind of founding ideals. I'm sure that I'm sure that for Scotland they would be very similar, but there might be other values that Scotland chooses to put forth in any constitution. So certainly that would be an affirmation that a written constitution can affirm these basic values. The second is why a written constitution is a better structuring of the political system. Now, you only have to look at Westminster for about 5 minutes to realize how constitutionally chaotic it is. I mean, in the Brexit debate has emphasized that very clearly. For example, right now they're debating whether or not Theresa May's government should be able to use the Henry VIII powers to basically write vast swaths of legislation without even parliamentary oversight. And one could easily argue that where should they derive those powers from? And with the UK Constitution, it's very much they kind of make it up as they go along from a constitutional point of view. So a written Scottish constitution could better structure the political system, and also have a more effective separation of powers, and what the powers of each branch of government are, being much more precisely defined than they are under the British under the UK state. Another very important thing that could be included in a written constitution is establishing both positive and negative rights, and also making them justiciable. Now, distinguishing the two, negative rights are rights that block the infringement of certain basic rights of the individual. For example, freedom of speech. People should be able to say what they want within the bounds of legitimate discourse. And so the state cannot interfere in that. So it's kind of like a shield, if you will. Or freedom of religion. People should be able to, religious practice should be free for everyone, and the state should not be able to infringe on that. So that's a negative right. Positive rights are more rights to things, like whether it's it could be housing, schools, healthcare, all of these things, and these could be guaranteed as positive rights. But very importantly, there needs to be a way of making these rights justiciable, and that they can be affirmed, and redress for violations can be effectively sought without recourse to spending thousands of pounds or euros or whatever it is at that time on lawyers or other, and to really bring about greater legal equality in giving access to everyone to the legal system to redress violations of their rights. Okay. Um, so that's just a few ideas on what a constitution could be, and I'll be certainly be going into more detail in the episodes to come. Second of all, why a republic? Why should Scotland be a republic? For me, it's a complete no-brainer. I mean, if you were to found a state today, would you have a monarch? No. It seems pretty it seems pretty obvious. And so the main reason that I believe that Scotland should be a republic when they become independent is that there would be true popular sovereignty rather than the sovereignty of the crown and parliament. And so, for example, in under the UK system, Parliament is in the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and in the and in the monarch. It's called parliamentary sovereignty or supremacy. The people don't have sovereignty under this system. I mean, I don't know how many people realize that, but the people are not sovereign. And it was only recently that British people became UK's people became citizens rather than subjects. And it's all so you've had this basis of legitimacy of divine right that basically still exists. I mean, it may not be expressed exactly in the same way as before, but you still the UK is still based on divine right, and people are not sovereign. It's the crown in Parliament that is sovereign. And so I think the most fundamental reason for becoming a republic is that they're able to, is that that Scots truly have sovereignty themselves, rather than in this UK bizarre system where an old lady and a bunch of dudes wearing vermin and a bunch of people in the House of Commons have sovereignty rather than the people. Second reason there should be a republic, and certainly and I alluded to this before, is to be able to get rid of the monarchy, certainly, and also the feudal aristocracy. And you still got dukes and viscounts and all this stuff, and that's just got to go. I mean, there's no way you can keep that around in an independent Scotland. So I mean, because when you have that, you literally have inequality baked into the UK Constitution. You have the monarch, the princes, the dukes, the earls, all that in this feudal hierarchy that hasn't really changed that much since for hundreds or for centuries. In France, you still have people who have these titles, but they have no. I mean, they can hold the title if they want, but there's no there's no power that comes out of that, or no position, and so I would argue that France is a more egalitarian society, and part of that is the fact that they were able to get rid of the monarchy and the aristocratic system that had prevailed up before the French Revolution. So again, so going back to popular sovereignty and eliminating the monarchy and the feudal aristocracy would go. Inequality would no longer be baked into the UK Constitution, and there would be a much more egalitarian society. And also the republic, because in order to have I would argue to have a good functioning government, you need an informed citizenry rather than having subjects. And so, I know that, and so learning about Scottish history, learning about civic institutions, that civic education be mandatory for all Scottish students, so they learn about their political system, they learn about how they can be good citizens. I think that's fundamental to helping build a better society over time. And I put in I also believe that it should be a secular republic. And when I say secular, this is not it has nothing to do with being anti-religious. Secular means there's no established church. Now, of course, in England, you have the Church of England, and the Queen is the head of the Church of England, and you have the Church of Scotland as well. And sure, I know that very few people actually go to these churches, and that the Scottish government has very little connection with the Church of Scotland. It's different from, for example, in the Westminster Parliament, but there should not be there should not be an established church in an independent Scotland. There should be there should be an equal treatment of all religions and basic state neutrality in regarding the religions, which will allow the freedom of all religions to flourish, and also people can feel free to be secular and non-religious as well, just treating all beliefs equally, but provided they do not, incite violence or are somehow upending the societal norms. And I think most importantly, particularly given Scotland's history, is the idea that there should be a better capacity to gradually eliminate sectarianism. And I know that, and you still have, particularly in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, the sectarian divides, and you have Catholics and Protestant schools. And and so it would be very interesting to move towards a much more a much more civically minded educational system that seeks to seeks to get down to break down these sectarian divides and allow and gradually over time make it so that people are just citizens and not defined by what religion they belong to. And the Constitution is not a panacea. It's not something that's just going to make all of these things occur overnight. However, it can contain the tools by which these things can be achieved over time. So I just want to talk a little bit more about what I plan to do with this project. And so, as I said, I have developed a draft constitution that I've taken from many sources. I don't at all claim to it have been all of my my doing, but I will be putting it up on the Independence Live website, and I hope to have a wiki with the help of my technologically minded friends to develop a Wikipedia version. In other words, that people can go to the draft and make suggestions of how it could be changed or how things could be done differently, and get as broad an input as possible into the into the draft to get as much collective wisdom as possible, and make the best draft possible that, as I said, would at the very least would be made available to any constituent assembly or constitutional convention that would be drafting a permanent constitution. And I think again that I think that would be a great success if that was the extent of it, just that some of the ideas here were adopted. And so some of the things that I'd like to focus on, and that I will be further exploring in future drafts, that I'd like just to kind of put these seeds out for you to think about. But things, for example, like financial regulation in a constitution. And I have a dear colleague, Jonas, in Greece, and
Hi,
he,
Jerry.
for example, made the suggestion that if you in a constitution
Okay.
had the equivalent of Glass-Steagall, now Glass-Steagall is a separation between financial banks, commercial banks and investment banks. And this was the Glass-Steagall was a New Deal policy in the United States instituted in the 1930s, which led to many, many decades of stability within the banking system, because the commercial and the investment banking were separate. And if you could put and when it was revoked, that's when a lot of the stuff, that led to some of the more recent crashes. So having that in a constitution where it could not be changed by
Okay.
literal law would be very interesting. That's just one example. Another one is in the environment, where there be a constitutional requirement that all chemicals, every ingredient of everything has to be listed, whether it's food, whether it's chemicals, whether it's that everything be listed on ingredients, and including things like genetically modified foods. All that has to be labeled if it's to be sold within Scottish borders. And then also environmental monitoring, and just making sure that well into the future that Scots have safe water, safe air, all of these things that are literally absolutely indispensable just for life itself. Another issue would be land reform, and whether or not in a constitution you could simply have the in a constitution you could specify that all land within Scottish borders has to be registered and taxed with the Scottish government, because as you probably are aware, much of the Scottish land, people don't even know who owns it. It's often held in offshore companies. It's often held by Saudi sheiks and Daily Mail editors and these other types of folks that don't, and then they don't have to pay taxes because of that. What would be really interesting would be to have a provision in the Constitution that says that unless the land is registered and taxed with Scotland, then it goes into private ownership. So if people don't register the land with the Scottish Land Trust, they lose it. That would be interesting. That might get them going on, registering and actually paying taxes and actually contributing to the betterment of Scotland, rather than shipping all their money offshore. So those are just a few ideas and things that I'll be expanding on in the near future. And as I said, I plan to have to do about a 20-minute excerpt each week, focusing on a different aspect of a Scottish constitution. And again, I will be seeking to set up a means by which all of you, anyone who wants to, can contribute to the discussion to further refine this draft, and also maybe and categories of law. We can talk about the EU. We can talk about talk about anything from a constitutional point of view. I'm always up for a good discussion. And just also these broadcasts will be just me speaking, but I will also be having other interviews and things where we can get more broad interaction. But I did want to make a constant this 20 or 25 minute clips that I'll be making, just so that I can say what my views on these different subjects. And then you're more than welcome to send me comments or questions that I can address in the other one. But as I said, I will be certainly holding more interviews as well with in which we can get more broad participation. Okay, so thank you for listening. I will be back next. I'll be back next week, next Thursday, with another excerpt. But please, tell your friends, share around, and let's get this discussion going on how we build a Scottish secular republic that's worthy of the struggle to become independent. Okay, thank you very much. See you next week.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And so we have with us to round out the conversation, Dr. Elliot Bulmer, constitutional scholar who worked extensively prior to the referendum in 2014 on a model constitution, of which the draft that I have elaborated is heavily based. So first of all, thanks for being with us, Elliot.
Thank you for having me. It's always a
Absolutely.
pleasure.
And I just wanted to get you to add a little bit more of what a constitution means, for a country to have one. I mentioned a couple things, having a basic, pronouncing your basic values, creating a coherent political system. What else can you add to that about what it would mean for Scotland to have a constitution?
Yeah, I think you covered all the most important bases of what a constitution is for. I think there's an important emphasis, though, which needs to be drawn out, which is that we often think about the transformative potential of a constitution, where a constitution can get us, what it can achieve in terms of building a better future. But I think particularly in cases of transition to independence, The Constitution does a lot of defensive work as well. It's one of its functions is to reassure, to provide a certain degree of legal certainty and of continuity, and really a guarantee that things won't get worse. Because when a new state is created, and after all, that's what independence is about, it's a state building project, lots of things can go wrong. And so part of winning the argument for independence and then making that independence actually work well is to constitute the state such that it is inclusive, such that the state cannot become the possession of any particular party or individual, that it remains something that is rooted in the common weal, and in particular to guard against three dangers. And those are authoritarian backsliding, i.e. the restriction of rights or democratic processes by those who get into power. Incumbent manipulation, which is similar but more subtle, and that's to do with the people who win elections changing electoral rules so that they win in future.
Right.
Which is something that a constitution can guard against. And thirdly, corruption in its widest sense of the word, i.e. the ability of special interests to influence political outcomes of the political landscape. So I think while the transformative potential of a constitution is exciting, we also need to bear in mind that the defensive and these reassuring purposes, that ultimately what the constitution guarantees is that the Scottish state will be a state for all its citizens, and that it will be the common possession of all its citizens. And so that we won't go from, as you say, an absolute Westminster to an absolute Scottish Parliament run by one party, which then uses the state as a partisan instrument. And we see many instances of that in newly independent states. And it never ends well. So the Constitution, and why the reason the Constitution is important and why it has to be thought about in advance, is to prevent that kind of state capture by those who win the first elections.
Okay, and what do you think? I mean, assuming there is another referendum within the coming months, or within the next couple of years, what do you think that that any Yes campaign or the SNP or whatever should put forward as at least constitutional principles, or before an actual vote, to do these things of what you exactly of what you say is reassurance that things are set to go on a better trajectory? I mean, what kind of what do you think can be done before a vote to in terms of setting out at least constitutional guideposts, or however you want to phrase it?
So I have a paper coming out with Commonweal at the moment that is looking precisely at this issue, and I think there are different ways in which this could be done. And in fact, the SNP's own position with regards to what to do in advance of A, the referendum day, and B, Independence Day, has varied over time. So the SNP's previous position, when they were in opposition, was to draft a constitution and to present this as a piece of policy. And then the independence bill would include that constitution, probably as a schedule to the bill. So that when you vote on independence, for independence with a particular constitutional model that has been put forward. And then if independence is approved, on Independence Day, that constitution comes into effect, and that's it. We then have a constitution. We can then amend it, but we have that constitution from the beginning. The SNP's policy, once they got into government, changed a bit, and their view then was to have this very minimal interim constitutional platform, and then to do the work of constitution making after independence. And there were various reasons that they put forward for that, none of which I find particularly convincing. But the reason they put forward that was most convincing was that there are greater opportunities for public debate and participation and involvement after an independence referendum. But I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that if you look at the model of the other countries which have become independent from the United Kingdom, of which there are many, this is a well-worn path. In many cases, they held independence conferences before independence, at which they worked out a constitution. And I think that looking back to the model of the Constitutional Convention in the 1990s that came up with the devolution settlement, which brought together various political parties, not all, but a sufficiently broad array of political parties, plus voluntary organizations, the churches, small businesses, trade unions, and created this sort of civic body which could negotiate a settlement. I think we could do the same again before an independence vote, so that the constitution which is then attached to the independence vote is not just the SNP's constitution or the constitution of any particular individual or party. It is a constitution which has been agreed and negotiated by some sort of civic representative body constituted in advance. And I lay it out. In fact, I had a recent article in the National in which I set out the time frame. So if you go to the National website and you Google my name, Elliot Bulmer, you'll see an article from the summer of this year, I think it was August, in which I set out sort of how that could be achieved. The advantage of that is that when you vote, you know what you're voting on. You're not asked to give anybody a blank check. That there is an agreed constitution which has been negotiated in advance and it's clear. But of course, that need not be final. That could be like the starter constitution.
How precise should it be? For example, should it stipulate that whether it's a republic or a monarchy, or should these much more transformative decisions be left till later? I mean, how do you see that?
So I think it needs to be precise, but maybe not necessarily as transformative. So I think that it has to be a full working constitution. And one of the problems that the Scottish government's draft in 2014 had was that it wasn't really a proper constitution. It was too vague.
The ones that were in the white paper, right?
Yeah.
Right. The bit that was in the white paper, yeah.
The one that was in the white paper, they called it a draft interim constitution. But it just didn't contain the kind of basic institutional details that you need in a constitution to perform even that defensive function. So it needs to be a proper, full working constitution. But at the same time, I think it needs to focus on the core aspects of what a constitution does. So setting out democratic processes, protecting rights, providing for its own amendment, establishing the sort of basic principles and legitimacy of the state. And it need not be necessarily at that stage a fully transformative document. That perhaps can come later. So I see this maybe advancing in two stages. The first stage is to make sure that on day one of independence, we have a constitution that provides for the basis of a working state. Step two is then to build upon that and maybe do some of the more radical stuff. But those two can be separated. So, for example, Malta became independent in 1964 with a constitution which was kind of a Westminster export version, kept the monarchy, etc. And then 10 years later, they became a republic. Once the institutions have bedded in, it's not the only way to do it, but I think that might not be a bad way to do it.
Okay, all right, and let's see, and so do you let's see, and what do you think are the other what do you think could be included in that with regard what are the types, sorry, I'm not being very precise, what are the types of elements that you've seen in other constitutions, given your scholarship on that could, for example, could reinforce democratic rights, and what are some of the specific provisions that you think that can play that defensive role that you were speaking about?
Yeah, so I mean, in my 2011 book, A Model Constitution for Scotland, I included a text that you're familiar with, but listeners might not be, which was my first attempt at drafting out what that could look like. And I've since done an updated version, which, as I say, will be published by Commonweal, hopefully later this year. And in that, I set out exactly the sorts of things that I believe a constitution should contain. And they are the basic generic things that all constitutions for modern democratic states have. So first part, if you like, setting out the basis of the state, territory, citizenship, national symbols, the source of sovereign authority being in the people, constitutional supremacy. Then a section that sets out the roles and functions of the head of state, making sure that's a purely ceremonial function. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then the powers of parliament, the judiciary, the executive, local government, and then what I call these fourth branch institutions. So institutions like the Auditor General and the Public Services Ombudsman, they need to be protected against partisan manipulation. And that could be in the Constitution as well. And then, of course, you need an amendment mechanism as to how the Constitution can be changed. For example, like a 3/5 majority in Parliament plus a referendum. So that's what the Constitution should contain. It should be relatively detailed and clear. In terms of specific proposals, what I would propose at the beginning is actually to maintain as much of what we have as possible, to constitutionalize it, but actually we don't want to have to create institutions. We're creating a constitution that will glue all those institutions together. But I think most people are mostly satisfied with how the Scottish Parliament is elected and how it works and how the Scottish Government is chosen, how the judiciary are appointed. We could improve all of those things. But I think the biggest thing at the first point, if you like, in a starter constitution, is to make sure they don't get worse. One of our listeners on Facebook says that scared no voters need to know if they vote yes this time, that the country isn't going to fall into the sea and sink. They didn't know what they were voting for last time, so they stuck with the devil they knew. And I think one of the things that a constitution does is it provides that reassurance, provides that certainty. It lets you know that you're not going to get worse than the devil you know.
Yeah.
And so I would use the existing practice as an example, and all this is set out in the text that I'm putting into the Commonweal white paper.
Okay, well, please make it available, and I'd be glad to read it and have in-depth discussions like this with you over it, because I think that's okay. 28th. Okay, all right, and I remember we had we held a conference together a few years back, and you made that really interesting allusion of whether a constitution is the rules of the road, or whether it's a roadmap. Is it just what you do in a particular how you operate, stop and, turn left, turn right, or is it saying we want to go there? I remember adding the idea that we should have sort of constitutional guardrails to make sure that the car doesn't fall off the cliff, so to speak, and is protected, in those ways. But I'm just wondering, how do you see the implementation of a lot of positive rights, things like the right to education, the right to a free education, the right to free healthcare, the right to all that, and it could be sometimes called a liberal wish list or something like that that may not stand the test of time if you have other parties. In terms of justiciable positive rights and these types of things, and from what you've seen in other constitutions, how well can that work? I mean, can we see, we can do this, we can do that, well, we can guarantee healthcare, we can do this with a constitution? Maybe how do you see it in terms of what it can and can't do in at least in that specific context of positive rights?
Okay, so this is a difficult question, and I think it can be quite a divisive one. There is an argument that is sometimes heard on the left against written constitutions, saying that written constitutions basically protect bourgeois rights. They protect property rights and they protect corporate rights, and they can be used to restrict and restrain really reforming radical socialist governments. I find that a completely unconvincing argument. However, there is a germ of truth in it, and that is that if you look at the most famous constitution, the US Constitution, it has been used in that way. Famous cases such as Lochner, New York, 1905, which basically said that states couldn't use their legislative power to protect workers' rights.
Yeah.
Now, I think the most important thing that a written constitution should do with regards to positive rights is to make it clear that the state has a responsibility for the common good. And that questions such as healthcare and education and pensions and unemployment insurance and all those things are legitimate aspects of social and political concern that the democratic state should deal with. Without necessarily creating justicable rules, which may create problems of enforcement. However, there are countries which have given those social and economic rights justicable status, and it can work. And courts have been quite constructive in some ways at recognizing that the Constitution is binding on the state to pursue those things, while still respecting the limits of their own role.
Yeah.
So you see examples in South Africa, for example.
It's important to strike. Yeah.
Yeah. I think my starting point in an initial constitution would be in favor of what's called directive principles. This is a common model found in Commonwealth constitutions. You find it in Ireland, in Malta. Ireland's not in the Commonwealth, but it has a similar Westminster tradition. You find it in Malta. You find it in by India, Nigeria. And these directive principles basically say, these are things that we, the people, say are important. We care about education, we care about healthcare, etc. But we're not going to dictate how the state delivers these things. We leave that up to the legislature, up to the government. But we're making it clear that this institution. I think that can be a good solution. I'm just looking at the chat room here, and I don't want to preempt the question, but there's a question here about, are there any elements a constitution would have that would identify it as uniquely Scotland's? And that's a fascinating question.
That is a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah, because in some ways, every constitution is unique. There are no two constitutions in the world that are exactly the same, and every constitution is tailored to its particular context. So, for example, there are fairly extensive in the Dutch constitution about water management, because this is integral to the Dutch country floods. It doesn't function.
Yeah.
There are provisions in the Swedish constitution about the reindeer hunting rights of the indigenous Sami people, because those are particular things for that particular context. And I think there may well be some specific aspects that relate to that would be put into a constitution. So, for example, questions about the role of Scots and Gaelic as official languages.
Yeah.
That could be a thing. On the other hand, however, it could be. I don't necessarily take a view one way or the other, but it could be the sort of thing that arises. On the other hand, constitutions are also, to some extent, cut and pasted. And one of the great things about the reassuring function of a constitution is that we've done all this before. Many countries have become independent from the United Kingdom, and they have constitutions or had constitutions at the moment of independence, which in some ways were remarkably similar. So if you look at the constitutions of Jamaica and Malta and the original constitution of Kenya, for example, in 1964, you will see huge similarities between them because, well, they're trying to achieve similar ends. So that there would be a lot that would not necessarily be unique, but it doesn't have to be, because there's no advantage to reinventing the wheel.
At least initially, yeah.
At least initially.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of things that I think are really strong in the Scottish constitutional tradition. Scotland does have its own unique constitutional tradition. And I wrote about this in my 2016 book, Constituting Scotland, the Scottish National Movement and the Westminster Model, in which I argued that there is a distinct Scottish constitutional tradition. It might not be fully recognised by the courts or by other authorities. Its status may be, it is not the orthodox position, perhaps, but it has been asserted by the Scottish National Movement, and I think it has fairly good historical foundations. And one of the things within that tradition is this strong concept of popular sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
The sovereignty in Scotland resides in the people. Now, that is a claim that has been reiterated by the claim of right. It is a claim that has been asserted several times in Scottish history, and that the SNP has always made its sort of foundational cardinal principle. I think one of the things that the Scottish Constitution would have to do is to give recognition to that principle.
Yeah.
And just to go on with that a little bit, you're talking about a republic. I'm not sure a republic is necessary for popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, as I understand it, is that there should be no fundamental change to fundamental law without the consent of the people.
Okay.
In other words, that major constitutional changes should require the approval of the people in referendum.
Okay, I was saying just quickly. I was saying that in the context of the British system, under which you have the notion of sovereignty being parliamentary sovereignty and not necessarily for the people. And so I'm wondering. I mean, has Scottish popular sovereignty been anything other than an idea, given that it's been under the UK for the last 300 years, which has this very distinct notion of Westminster parliamentary sovereignty?
According to Orthodox unionist legal doctrine, no, it's been nothing more than an idea. But it's been a hugely powerful idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been an idea that hasn't died and hasn't gone away. And it's been an idea which has been fundamental to the Scottish National Party and the Scottish National Movement more broadly. And I think it's an idea that would have to be reflected in a constitution. But, it's not a binary choice. You can have popular sovereignty and still keep the monarchy if there were reasons to do so. So, for example, the SNP's 2002 draft constitution refers to the Queen only as head of state because the people are sovereign. So it says very clearly that sovereignty is vested in the people, and then creates a hereditary office of head of state with mostly ceremonial functions. This idea that the Queen is sovereign or the Queen in Parliament is sovereign is a British idea, but it is not the only idea on which the monarchy could be continued. So, for example, if you look at I've recently returned from Tuvalu in the South Pacific, and the Constitution of Tuvalu is well worth the read, because it says there very clearly that we, the sovereign people of Tuvalu, appoint essentially the Queen to be our head of state in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution. So it inverts the order. It keeps the monarchy, and they have reasons that they want to do that for. And those are reasons of continuity and reassurance that may well apply in a specific context. But it does so on, if you like, Republican principles.
Sure. I mean, just from an American perspective, the idea of popular sovereignty would very much include choosing your head of state, in a popular and democratic manner. I mean, that for me, at least, that's sort of the essence of a republic, of being able to, choose who the head of state is. And I know that we have a different conception of the presidency and the head of state, and every country has it differently. But for me, they're incompatible. But, I mean, obviously there's different views on that.
Yeah. I mean, I tend personally to stick with the line of one of the authors of the Belgian Constitution in the 1830s, who said, "I will accept the monarchy, but a monarchy on the most popular and republican principles." And it's an interesting quirk of the Belgian Constitution that the monarch does not accede to the throne on the death of their predecessor. They accede to the throne only after having taken the constitutional oath.
Okay.
So it's not like the king is dead, long live the king, that they inherit the position. The king is dead. There is no king until a new king is sworn in on the constitution, because it's elevating the constitution above the crown. So my gripes with the monarchy are essentially to do with the way in which we use the monarchy as a substitute for a constitution, and the idea of the sovereignty of crown in parliament. And I think we get rid of all of that, and still, if we wish, maintain a ceremonial monarchy for purposes of reassuring that section of the population for whom that is important during an interim period.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. And just to wrap up our excellent discussion, how do you see the next? I mean, do you think there will be another referendum called soon? I mean, obviously it's unpredictable, but just in my view, I mean, with Brexit impending, it seems to me as if Scotland should have a choice within the next year, at the very most, to make a decision whether to go, with the UK into Brexit, or independence with some type of at least EU holding pattern, staying within, the single market, maintaining regulatory convergence at least for a while until, until we can, after independence, you can figure out whether it's EFTA or the EU or
Yeah.
what. How do you see it?
So I think the most important thing is we have to win the next referendum. When you look at referendums around the world, often what you find is that the first referendum really opens the debate. It gets a thing on the agenda, gets people talking about it, but first referendums are not always decisive. Second referendums generally are.
Mm-hmm. So what are precedents for that? Because you're more versed in it than I am. But what are some precedents? And also referendums that happen within like a 3 or 4 year span.
Yeah. The Quebec independence referendums, I think, would be a good example.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was defeated. The issue stayed live. There were attempts to sort of come to terms with the situation Canada-wide. Then they had the second referendum, which was very narrowly defeated. But that basically ended the movement. After that, there hasn't been a substantial push. Other examples, I mean, there have been referendums in Portugal. I think there's a referendum in Portugal on abortion, where the first one really kind of opened the debate and the second referendum closed the debate, those sorts of things.
So you're not only saying about independence referendums, but just referendums in general over a specific topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in terms of the timing, the most important thing is that it's held at a time when we can win.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's finished.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Hello.
She's coughing a bit. So the most important thing is that we can win. Second thing is, do I think that we have a strong moral case for a second referendum because of Brexit? Yes, absolutely. If we take the principle of popular sovereignty seriously, then the question of when and how to hold a referendum has to be decided in Scotland, not by the UK government. The UK government has long held the view that countries wishing to be independent, when they manifest that wish sufficiently strongly at the ballot box, can have it. The UK government, since the American Revolutionary War, does not take a policy of holding countries against its will.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is I think that the Catalan situation and Theresa May together create a dangerous set of circumstances in which Catalonia shows what can happen if you get it wrong. They overplayed their hands, and they tried to hold a referendum without the agreement. They didn't have the equivalent of the Edinburgh Agreement, which allowed the 2014 referendum in place. Then they declared independence anyway, and it didn't go anywhere. And I think that the challenge will be to convince the British government that it ought to behave towards Scotland no worse than it behaved towards its former colonies during the era of decolonisation. Which is to say, when the Scottish people say we want independence, independence should be granted, and there should be a fair and a negotiated process for doing that. My fear is the way in which the British government is heading after Brexit. I'm not sure they have that degree of maturity.
I don't either.
I'm not sure they have I mean, even Margaret Thatcher was adamant that, if Scotland returned the majority of MPs that wanted independence, that Scotland would get independence.
Yeah.
But by that calculation, Scotland should have been independent in 2015.
Yeah, after they got 56 out of 59 seats, exactly.
Exactly. So the biggest challenge we face is how to hold a referendum legally and in a way in which we've already bound the British government to accept the result. And that's going to be a challenge. And I think one of the things that we need to do there is to make this parallel, not between Scotland and places like Catalonia. Don't make it about nationalism in that sense. Rather, draw the connection between the other British former colonies. You know, when Canada became independent, they didn't feel sort of any less British because of it, perhaps initially, but it was a change in the system of government. It wasn't an identity issue fundamentally. And I think maybe if we can do the constitution making beforehand, we can come up with a clear constitution, then we can make it clear that this is a choice between alternative states. So in the same way as people have felt British, as the same way as people have felt Scottish within a British state for the last 300 years, those who feel British could still feel British within a Scottish state.
Absolutely.
If they choose to do so.
Absolutely.
A Britishness would be a different thing, perhaps, but it would still be there. And I think that is a way of getting out of an emotional argument where it comes down to how people feel and their identity, and it's all in the heart. And it enables people who say, yes, I'm British and I'm an internationalist, but I'm also Scottish. But on the question of to which state do I entrust my future? This state, which has a proven track record, which has a democratic constitution that is inclusive, that defends my rights, that gives me these legal guarantees, or this state, which was once a mighty empire but is no more, and offers me none of those reassurances. To which of those will you entrust your future? And if we can do that, then we can make independence the safe bet, which is what it is. It is the safe bet. And when the UK ship is sinking, I think that will become ever more attractive. And I know many people, and I'm sure you do too, who are friends of mine who voted no in 2014, who would say they would now at least consider voting yes. We've got to do our homework. We've got to do our homework on the constitution, on the currency, on the economy, on diplomacy. We can't do what the Catalans did and go off half-cocked. We've got to get it right because it's the last chance.
Okay. On that note, we will end this program, but it was so delightful to speak to you, Elliot, and get your views on this. As I said, I put this draft up that, I welcome any insight into, hope to put it into a wiki format where we can develop it more further, just as one thing to add to the conversation, not viewing it as anything definitive, but just getting people thinking, getting people contributing to the constitutional discussion. And I'm so glad that you're part of that. And we'll continue to speak. And again, once your paper comes out, we'll do a nice review of it here, and you can come on and talk about it. Okay.
That would be great. I've also just attached sent to you the draft provisional constitution that I've done in 2017, which you may also wish to share.
I will put it on the Independence Live blog.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.